everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Rehash, a Web3 podcast. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and today on our final episode of Season 9, we're speaking with Jill Gunter, Chief Strategy Officer at Espresso Systems, the coordination layer that unites chains, rollups, and applications. We start off with a hot topic nowadays, which is whether we should be focusing more of our time on building infrastructure or building applications. There was a lot of discourse at UCC and Brussels over the summer about infrastructure, and that got people asking, well, what about the apps? Where are all of the apps? You might assume that you know where Jill stands on this topic as somebody who's working on a middleware solution, but there's actually a lot more to the story, which she shares in this episode. Jill has lots of excellent analogies to help us better understand technical concepts like shared sequencers and rollups, and she debunks some common misconceptions that people have about Espresso ahead of their mainnet launch later this quarter. This is an excellent episode for the non-technical person to listen to better understand how various components of blockchains work, as well as for the more technical person to maybe have some of their uncertainties about shared sequencers and the work that Espresso is doing around all of that cleared up. Since this is the last episode of the season, we'll be starting another round of guest elections this upcoming Monday, September 23rd, 2024. So make sure you secure a Rehash NFT if you haven't already done so, and start thinking about who you might want to nominate for the podcast next season. As a reminder, we are a community-owned podcast, which means all of our past guests were nominated and voted on by our community of podcast collectors. And anybody can join in the fun by collecting a Rehash episode on-chain at pods.media/rehash. Also, do make sure you've joined our community on Telegram at t.me/rehashweb3. That's going to be the best place to get all of your questions about the podcast answered and to chat and hang out with fellow Rehash listeners. The chat always gets extra lively during election week, so hop in before all of that starts on Monday. Last thing I wanted to mention is we're hosting a live podcast show in Detroit on Saturday, September 28th. So if you're in the area and want to come watch, it is entirely free. You'll just need to RSVP, and you can find that link on our website at rehashweb3.xyz or in our Telegram group at t.me/rehashweb3. We'll be publishing some of those episodes over the next few weeks, so you won't have to worry about any downtime in content, even though we're wrapping up the season. Thank you all for another incredible season, and I can't wait to see which guests and conversations you all bring us in Season 10. But for now, back to this episode with Jill. Jill was nominated for Rehash by Meg Lister and voted onto the podcast by Richie Bonilla, Irina Marinescu, Meg Lister, and myself, Diana Chen. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Jill. Jill Gunter, I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. I think you're somebody that I've been following on Twitter for a while. You just have like really good and smart takes, and I'm really glad that Meg nominated you for the podcast this season, and we are finally getting the chance to meet and to have a conversation. So welcome.
Thank you. No, it's great to be here. And yeah, longtime fan and follower, so very much mutual.
Amazing. So I want to start off with having a little discussion about infra versus apps. I know this is kind of a big point of conversation on crypto Twitter and in the crypto space in general right now. And I've pretty much heard it all, I feel like. And I think I know where you stand on this subject based on some of your tweets. But I would love to just kind of start from the basics of like where your head is at with infra versus apps. How do you view this? Because I've heard people talk about it in so many ways. Like, where's your head at with infra? Like, what infra represents today? What apps represent? And like, what is the main differentiator?
For sure. Yeah, maybe I'll start with like kind of my own personal journey on this topic and journey through crypto in general. I have always been an apps girl. I do not have a hard technology background. I never studied computer science. You know, if you had told me that I would be running a blockchain middleware company someday a few years ago, I would have been like, no, there's no way, you're full of it. I got into this space because I was excited about payments applications. This was, like 10 years ago now. And then I got excited about various kind of enterprise-oriented applications, how blockchains might be able to be used for securities settlement, all of those kind of 2015, 16 vibes kind of narratives. And since then, I've spent a lot of time exploring DEXs and identity applications, social applications, etc. So I have always been, again, an apps girl. However, over the course of my time in crypto, I feel like I've just had to rediscover over and over again that the infrastructure isn't ready yet. And that might be the infrastructure in terms of the types of privacy guarantees that you can get from blockchains or selective disclosure guarantees. Fun fact, fun little bit of Espresso Systems lore. We actually started out working on that problem of privacy and then totally evolved and kind of changed the strategy and evolved the product over time. But whether it's things like that, really limit the types of features that are available, or whether it's the limitations on the level of obviously scale and throughput and low cost that you can get and still not have to lose or sacrifice decentralization. That's been another huge focus of the company at various points in time, or really what we're focused on today, which is being able to have scale and also retain composability, interoperability, et cetera. Like all of these things are fundamentally infrastructure problems that really limit what applications can get built. And I think it's very easy for someone like me who, again, historically was not really deep in the infrastructure to sit here and dream of all of the applications that are being built and say like, oh, where are these applications? Why haven't they taken off yet? Why aren't the users flooding into the market? Why is it only celebrity meme coins and, other kind of toy applications that we're seeing? It really comes back to the infrastructure not being ready. So that's where I stand. I think that it's, again, very easy for folks to look around and say, there's too much infrastructure being built. Where are the apps? We've got to refocus as an industry. But when you're in it, and I think if you talk to people who actually are building the applications, they're focused on the infrastructure themselves because they need to be. We're not ready to just be focused on user acquisition yet.
I totally hear you. The way that I've sort of thought about infra versus apps personally is, and this is because I love spending time out in nature. I love going for hikes, spending time in the mountains. I always think of it as the infra is the trails, right? That get you to the top of the mountain. The apps are the experiences along the way. It's the views you get at the top. It's, the wildlife that you see along the way, the experiences. And the way that trails are developed, right? Say you have a mountain that's completely unexplored and people start exploring it for the first time. The way that you identify where to build those trails is you look at where people or where the animals that live there are already tracking those trails.
Oh, interesting.
Right. You don't just kind of take out a map and think oh, this, it would make sense this way. I mean,
Totally.
That's part of it is of course you don't want to build a trail off the side of a cliff. You need to make sure that the topography makes sense too to build a trail there. But the easiest way is to just look at where the wildlife is already moving through the woods and through the brush, because that is going to be the easiest path for people to move as well. And so that's where you would build the trail. So in that sense, I think it doesn't really make sense to build apps before infra, because you don't know if you're building the apps in the places where the infra can get to even.
Totally.
But at the same time, I understand the argument that people are making in the space for apps, focusing more on apps, because if your goal is to onboard the next billion to crypto, as many people say it is, then you do need something interesting and exciting to draw people in, right? Most people aren't going to be oh, I just love the grueling nature of dragging my ass up to the top of a mountain. That makes me feel really good. Most
I
people
do love that personally.
I do actually.
Maybe that's where I'm working in infra now.
Yes, I think we're in the minority though. I think for most people,
for sure.
They see the Instagram reels of how beautiful it is at the summit, or they see these cute outfits that girls are wearing on the mountains and taking these cute Instagram photos or whatever. And it's these things that draw people in. So in that sense, I think the analogy there is maybe it's the apps that are going to draw people into crypto, is these fun experiences that people see we're having here in the space. And then the infra needs to happen at some point, but it's kind of like people behind the scenes, like can devs do something? Devs just go and
so
do
true.
make it happen.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, so I went to ETHCC a couple of months ago now this summer. And even I, as someone who firmly believes that we need all of this infrastructure to really come along and mature in order to enable all of these applications, even I left ETHCC and I was like, whoa, everyone is working on, these various layers, whether it's building an L2, whether it's building a better L1, DA layers, sequencing layers, which is obviously what I'm focused on, all of these different things. It's kind of like, oh, it would have been nice to have more experiences here. Like Cello, I think, is a really great example of someone who leaned into the experiences. They had obviously ETHCC was in Belgium, and so they had like a Belgian waffle stand outside of the conference where you could go and pay with stable coins on their platform. I think Base did something quite similar. And, those are great examples of really focusing on use cases, but is few and far between relative to all of the infra. But I think that we've, for a really long time now, at least since 2016, with kind of the ICO hype that happened around then, we've been saying as an industry, oh, we're in like 2000, 2001 of the internet. And I just don't think that's true. Maybe that was true from like a capital formation perspective and a hype perspective, because certainly kind of the bubble of, call it capital formation, was happening then. But I think from an infrastructure perspective, we've been in like the ARPANET, like 70s and 80s period of the internet. And I think that it's coming. I think that we're going to be ready here for prime time and mainstream use cases, and the sort of broadband moment of crypto is on its way. But I think that we actually do need the dozens of projects and the hundreds of people who are working in the trenches on what a lot of people view as kind of the unsexy stuff behind the scenes to make it happen.
I guess the question is just how long can we sustain builders that are building infra without any users using it before it's like, we're out of money. This isn't bringing any ROI. Like, we've got to call it quits.
I don't see that happening. I don't think I think that that's a narrative out there of like, oh, there's no actual users of these platforms yet. And, where is the adoption? Who are you building for? And I can empathize with that perspective. I get it. I see where it's coming from. And I think a lot of projects that even have legitimate use cases get a bad rap, perhaps, for just having, this notion of like, oh, it's just sort of airdrop farmers that, they're not actual sticky users. There's no retention, et cetera. But I don't know. I mean, we are not live yet. We have mainnet slated for this coming quarter. But, I look at the folks who are committed to building with Espresso and using us as their sequencing layer. They're building real use cases, and they've got real enthusiastic communities who are either getting on board with their platforms or who soon will be. And I just think, okay, it may not be that sort of like feeling of like the mainstream moment that people want it to be, but there are users. And so I don't see it as a binary, basically. I don't think that it's a black and white kind of dynamic. I think that there's a spectrum here of usage, use cases, and users getting on board. I think one of the main things that I'm thinking about, just to share as someone who is building on the infrastructure side, is like, okay, when we go live with mainnet, we've got to have real transactions coming onto the platform pretty shortly thereafter. So that's something that we're talking to the rollups who are integrating with us about, and, understanding their perspectives and those dynamics for them. And it is there and it's growing. And I think that the usage is only going to continue to grow as we continue to improve the experience for you. I think that, people are too quick to dismiss and say, oh, none of this is real yet. It is happening.
Okay, so let's dive into some of the more technical things that you've talked about. So Espresso, which is where you work, is a shared sequencing layer. So shared sequencing, we want to talk about that. We want to talk about rollups. I actually love the tweet that you just put out recently about the analogy comparing all of that to Dungeons and Dragons.
Yes.
which I love. Full disclaimer, I've never actually played Dungeons and Dragons
Full
before, but
disclaimer, me
from
neither. You think I know how it works.
from my based on my understanding of the game, I thought your analogy was spot on. So would you mind just rehashing that for the audience who did not read your tweet?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so firstly, I have to give credit where it's due to this account, Slug Posts. I don't actually know who this is, but they have been posting these amazing kind of Eli 5 explainers for all of these different protocols. And so this was very much inspired by that. And you should go follow them if you liked this and you want more of this. They do a great job of comparing, for example, like eigenlayers to a children's playground. And so what I went with here is indeed explaining espresso and this concept of sequencing and shared sequencing in the context of games. So firstly, to understand espresso and what espresso is doing, I think you want to understand, of course, Ethereum and why a lot of people use Ethereum in the first place. And from my perspective, there's a few different things that you get when using Ethereum, but one of them, crucially, is this open composable platform. What is composability? It's this money Legos quality of the platform where any application can make a contract call to any other application. You know, someone over here can build a financial primitive and then folks over there can build off of it. And fundamentally, that's a more kind of innovative, creative, open experience than you get in pretty much any Web 2 ecosystem, certainly in any TradFi ecosystem where it's all of these kind of walled gardens. So the comparison there that I would make, the analogy, is that, you know, you and your friends might be into playing games, and maybe you've played a bunch of board games and just been kind of uninspired by the fact that you're really constrained by the rules of the game. You're really constrained by what's on the game board in front of you. There's not a lot of room to get creative or to kind of build your own world. And that, again, that reminds me a lot of the kind of TradFi and Web 2 platforms that we have today for developers. Now you discover this whole world of role-playing games, tabletop games like Dungeons and Dragons, where fundamentally there are no hard and fast rules. You have someone who's called a dungeon master in the context of Dungeons and Dragons who makes up the story as you go. And there can be a lot of creativity and innovation that you get with that. And that, again, reminds me a lot of what you get with blockchain platforms, with Web3 in general, and with Ethereum specifically. So, okay, you're all playing Dungeons and Dragons, and your stories keep getting better, and the gameplay keeps improving. And suddenly you've got all of these people lined up around the block who want to play with you. They want to get into your basement and they want to play with you. This is kind of where we got to a few years ago, I would say, with some of the apps on Ethereum, where they started really taking off. Again, the experience became better. People got like the innovation, the kind of uniqueness of why build apps on a blockchain platform. And they were lined up around the corner. It became really expensive for them to use. And the system got really congested and clogged. And it just, the experience deteriorated because of all of the folks who wanted to be involved. So that's again, like having people lined up around the block wanting to play Dungeons and Dragons with you. So what do you do about that? Well, okay, you've got to scale. And so the way that you can scale in the game is say, okay, we're not going to have hundreds of people playing around the same table. Instead, we're going to start having, 20 different tables with 5 people at each of them. This you can think of as kind of akin to the roll-up roadmap for Ethereum. We're going to scale horizontally. We're going to have many chains. We're going to have many, in this case, tables and many different games going on. What's the problem with that? It's fragmentation. You lose the fact that you all wanted to come together and create this world together. You lose the fact in the context of Ethereum that you wanted to have any application be able to build off of and call any other. And so you lose some of the innovation that you can get there, both in the game and in the context of Ethereum. What Espresso is solving is this problem of fragmentation that has come as you've tried to scale. Now, what a lot of people think of when they hear shared sequencing is this idea, to use the game analogy, that you'd have one dungeon master working across all of the 20 different tables that you have in the room, that you'd have still one person creating the story and architecting it and kind of conducting the gameplay. And there's a bunch of problems that can happen there. And this is something that we've spent a lot of time talking to rollups about over the last year. Is there concerns that having one sequencer or one dungeon master in this case is going to reintroduce a lot of the same scaling bottlenecks that they'd had previously? The worry that having one dungeon master is going to be this kind of like big dependency that they have, that they as a table will not be able to still play their own game and still create some of their own elements of the world, that they'll have to run everything through this dungeon master who they're outsourcing to. And also the kind of monopoly power that that dungeon master might have. Like if they're the one who's always creating the story, then there's this feeling of like outsourcing to them and outsourcing perhaps revenue that each table might be trying to make if they're charging people to play at the table, things like this. So instead, the way that we solve this and the way that we approach shared sequencing, we also call it coordinated block building, because I think that's a little bit more descriptive of what's actually happening, is to say, okay, for any given turn or for any given block on the network, you could have a shared master between a few different tables, if for that turn it makes sense to do so. So if for a given block, you want to have two applications be making contract calls between each other, and they happen to be on different rollups, if you have a turn in the game where two different tables want to coordinate and build something together, or have a spell cast at one table impact a battle happening at another, then you can have a shared dungeon master for that turn. And you can even introduce a little bit of randomness to this, where the dungeon masters maybe have to roll the dice to see who's going to be the dungeon master for that turn. This, again, is more how we approach shared sequencing now, where it's on an ad hoc basis, on a turn-by-turn basis, but you still get all of those benefits of coordinated block building to solve fragmentation. So again, I'm waiting for the D&D people to come after me, because I've never actually played. I've been kind of D&D curious for a while, and I have some friends who are into it, and I did run it past them. We're like, this kind of works. We don't really understand the blockchain side, but that's my analogy for the day.
I love it. It makes perfect sense for me too. And apologies to any D&D professionals who are like, this is like so off, doesn't make sense. But I think for most people listening who like have some basic understanding of D&D and aren't like a professional, like they'll get it.
Yeah, appreciate it.
I love the analogy. So essentially what Espresso does as a shared sequencer is, or a coordinated block builder, which I haven't heard that before, but I like it, is that you can, if you're a builder, you can basically decide on this block, I want to share my resources with Jill. On the next block, I want to share my resources with Vitalik. Is that kind of how it works? It's like a turn by turn thing?
Yeah, conceptually, that's right.
Okay.
So the way that we actually implement this is through building a marketplace, where on the one side of the marketplace is kind of the sellers on the marketplace. You have each individual chain. And you can think of it like they're selling block space for that block, or the kind of the transaction ordering rights, like who gets to build that block. This is not so different from the way that it actually works on Ethereum today, right? Where you have proposer-builder separation, and for any given block, a proposer will sell the rights to build that block to a specialized block builder. We can get more into that if you want to as well. I think that there's still a lot of naivete amongst people who aren't deep in the Ethereum weeds that's not how it works, but fundamentally that's how the vast majority of blocks are getting built on Ethereum. And we basically want to bring that same dynamic to rollups, with, again, the main differentiator being that on a turn-by-turn basis or on a block-by-block basis, you might have the same builder building the block, coordinating between multiple different chains. And so if it ends up making sense that, two chains are just constantly making contract calls to each other, bridging to one another, things like this, then it may make sense for those chains to share pretty much every turn the same block builder. And that'll be reflected then in the incentives that are being created through kind of the transaction ordering of those two different chains. It may also make sense for two chains to actually never share the same block builder and never have coordinated block building, because one of them is like a gaming chain that's serving just a certain type of user and only really needs to interact with a couple of other games. And the other one is like a DeFi-oriented chain and has nothing to do with it. And so that's really the flexibility that we're designing for and that we're trying to build in. And the other important piece of this that I just highlight is you've got to incentivize any of this, right? And so that's, again, where the marketplace piece of this comes along, is we can't just say, oh, just come plug into the Espresso sequencer and just outsource this all the time for all of those reasons that I discussed. Is that rollups are concerned about outsourcing something as important as sequencing to a third party, even if that third party is decentralized. They're worried about giving up their sequencing revenue. They want to be guaranteed that if they do use a shared sequencer, they'll be making at least as much revenue as they would otherwise. And the way to solve all of this is, again, to incentivize it. And the way to do that is through this kind of block building marketplace. So that's been a lot of the kind of product architecture and design work that we've been doing over the last year to make that possible.
Do you think that security is compromised at all with shared sequencers? Because I'm sure that's like one of the top things that people are thinking of when they're deciding whether or not to like outsource their stuff to like a third party, is like, is their security going to be as tight as mine? Like, that's like
totally.
the number one thing. Yeah,
totally. Well, there's a lot of different things, of course, that we might mean when it comes to security. A lot of course, what we tend to mean when we talk about this in blockchain and crypto is from a perspective of decentralization. So therefore, a perspective of safety and liveness. And, the vast majority of these rollups today are just relying on a single centralized sequencer. And so, from that perspective, okay, most rollups have a mature escape hatch. And so, if the sequencer is censoring their transaction or the sequencer goes down for a prolonged period or something like this, they can use the escape hatch. But that escape hatch also might be prohibitively expensive. And so, what we're really working to introduce here is a better system from all of that perspective, where, if you're relying on a marketplace, if one block builder is down, who's effectively acting as the sequencer, then there's, a dozen other builders in the marketplace bidding to do the ordering for your block. And then the other component that we have is a decentralized network, which you can think of as almost akin to like an L1 or kind of like a lazy L1 where it's not doing any execution, which is how Celestia talks about themselves as a DA layer, but we're doing this for sequencing. That layer can give some economic security and some backing to any pre-confirmation that's being given. So today, to back up for a second, the way that the user experience of a lot of L2s actually works is that whether it's a bridge or an application or whatever, it's relying on this pre-confirmation from the sequencer, because otherwise you've got to wait this prolonged period for things to be finalized on the L1. That's not a really robust promise in most of these cases because the sequencer is centralized. And so again, the other component of Espresso outside of the marketplace is this network that can offer a stronger pre-confirmation and a stronger guarantee. So, from all of those perspectives, we're working really hard to actually make it be a better system than the status quo today. Of course, there's always going to be concern of relying on an outside, not party in this case, because it is decentralized, but an outside network, in the same way that you might be worried about building an application as a developer on a brand new L1 that, does not have a track record. I think that those are risks that most folks in this space are willing to live with, because as we talked about at the top of the conversation, there's just so much desire to continue to improve the user experience and to adopt new infra like that, the stuff that we're building.
Yeah. And so from the consumer or the user perspective, what does that mean for the end user? If, people are using Espresso like shared sequencers, they're sharing their dungeon masters, like what does that mean for the end user?
Yeah, totally. Well, before we get to the end user, maybe I'll actually just talk about the developer first, the app developer, because it's the app developer who's going to determine the experience of the user. But for the app developer, what they get back is composability. And the way I think about this is that For the end user, we talk about interoperability, so the ability to move really seamlessly across different domains, across different rollups and chains. For the developer, we talk about composability, where that's the ability for the developer to be able to interact with very seamlessly and work with applications that have already been built on different chains. And so that's what the developer gets back with sort of what the vision is of Espresso. That's really the key thing, the key takeaway is that the developer gets that composability back. They get this feeling of building on this completely open platform. They get that feeling of being able to build with money Legos reintroduced. They don't have the headache anymore of having to decide, like, okay, I need to pick a roll up to build on and to focus on. You know, is it going to be Arbitrum 1 or Base or Optimism? Like, let me sit down and do like a business and distribution analysis of all of these different chains, really understand the difference between them. Developers don't want to be doing that. That's what I've noticed. App developers are not excited about having to do that analysis. And so what they're doing is they're deploying across all of these different chains and just kind of hoping something sticks. The other thing developers are doing today is they're considering building their own chains, which might make a lot of sense from a business perspective of being able to capture value from their application, from their users. It might also make sense just from the perspective, they're like, well, you know, if I'm going to focus on one third-party chain anyway, then I might as well just build my own and accept that I'm going to be living in this kind of silo, but that's going to be the case more or less, no matter what choice I make. Or they're saying, okay, I'm just going to go elsewhere. Like, I'm going to go build on Solana because that's one unified platform. That's what I was trying to do to begin with. So again, we're trying to obviate that whole thought process for them and have it really just come down to, okay, you know, maybe they want to build an Arbitrum Orbit chain because they do like that tech stack better, but it's not this decision about what silo to go and be stuck in. What that means for users, I think, is a better, more seamless, interoperable experience overall, but also just more innovative apps that they're going to get access to. That, you know, the game, the on-chain game that they're playing, that game developer was not stuck in some silo of just building their own roll-up and only having, you know, the in-game assets, for example, exist within that ecosystem, but they're now able to use them like on the DEX over here and get all of those qualities that make blockchains, I think, valuable to begin with. So that's, I mean, people often ask me again to this point of like, oh, like, Jill, you've always been more focused on applications. How did you end up building this really deep infra project? And for me, I still am totally focused on applications. It's just that like, this is the way of getting there.
Yeah, well, that was something I was going to bring up earlier, too, when we were talking about infra versus apps, is with app chains now, like more and more developers who want to build an app being like, well, let me just launch my own blockchain to build my app on. With these app chains, it almost like kind of blurs the lines between infra and apps, where your app chain is an app, but it's also infra.
Totally. And I think to some degree, this has kind of always been the case. Like, there was a time when people were talking about contracts on Ethereum as infra as well on some level, but now it's definitely the case. And I think it does put app developers in this interesting position where, you know, previously they would have to onboard to the Ethereum ecosystem and learn Solidity and sort of understand some of the specifics of Ethereum. But now they're having to dive into the weeds on things like data availability and sequencing, just all of these architectural choices that they're having to make. And some of them are very happy for that. And I think it'll serve a lot of them well in the long run because they'll have control of all of these different components of their system. But a lot of them are just like, man, I'm just trying to build a cool thing for users. Like, I'm not trying to have to spend 6 weeks researching all of the different DA layers or sequencing layers. So I do think that we're at this kind of funny point in time where we've seen this convergence between apps and infra. And I hope that we're going to start to remove the need for developers to have to go that deep and just allow them to ship.
Yeah. What do you think that means for the future of rollups? Because right now they kind of have this ability to be like, well, Arbitrum has this vibe to it. Like these types of apps like to build on Arbitrum versus Optimism versus Base versus like these other chains. If there is no real differentiator because of shared sequencing, because, you know, everything is becoming more and more interoperable, what does it mean for the future of, I guess, like the existing L2s and also future L2s? Like, does that mean we're not really going to see more L2s, like L2s that are beyond just like a specific app chain? L2s like come up, and then what's going to happen with like the existing ones?
No, I think that we're still going to see a huge number. I think we're going to see actually an unlock in terms of the number of L2s that we see launching. And I do think that many of those L2s are still going to decide to align themselves with a given ecosystem by building, for example, an Arbitrum Orbit chain, or, you know, obviously Optimism within the super chain. But it's going to be a choice that they make, not based on sort of what apps or like what distribution channel of users they want access to, but it's going to be a choice that they make based on which tech stack makes the most sense for them. Yeah, not necessarily having to dive into like their own decisions around DA and sequencing, because I do think that leaders will just emerge in those categories. But I also think that there will be some alignment based on sort of like the overall vibes of these ecosystems, which you're alluding to. And I don't think that that's going to go away no matter how much we remove the barriers between these different ecosystems. I still think that there is going to be sort of specific culture and specific governance dynamics and all of these types of things that rollups who are in development are going to have to make choices around, depending on sort of how their ethos aligns with different choices that they'll have to buy into from the different ecosystems, and all of that. Vitalik had a really great post, I think it was 6 months or so ago, around different sort of subcultures that have emerged within Ethereum. And I think that it did a great job of capturing that. And I think that it's actually a great thing for Ethereum that it can support these subcultures. But I don't think it should come at the expense of fundamentally what Ethereum offers, which should be this composability across the whole chain. The last thing I'll say on this is the way that I tend to think about this is a little bit the various streaming platforms that we have today. This isn't an imperfect analogy, of course, but if you think about going on to Netflix or HBO Max or Apple TV, you know, all of the programming on those different platforms, you can tell that there's sort of like a vibe to it, or there's sort of like, you know, a common thread in terms of production value or themes that you might get. Like, you know, it's going to be a different experience to open up Netflix versus Apple TV versus Amazon Prime. And I think that it's going to be a little bit like that in terms of which rollup stack and which rollup ecosystem that you're in. But where it differentiates is I don't think it's going to be a walled garden. I don't think it's going to be this experience where like users have to then opt into, and developers as well have to opt into just one ecosystem. And then, you know, if they want to watch something that's not on Netflix, that's on Apple TV, it's like, well, okay, now I've got to maybe not just subscribe, but like go through this whole onboarding process. This is a huge headache. I don't think it's going to be like that.
That's a great analogy. Yeah. That it's crazy to imagine that like if you choose Netflix as your streaming service, then like you are not allowed to use Hulu. Or
Totally.
like if you did want to download Hulu to watch a show, it would be this complicated process that would turn a lot of people away. Yeah, no, I love that analogy. I think all of that sums it up really well. I want to also talk to you about Solana. You brought that up earlier in comparison to Ethereum, or at least, you know, Ethereum rollups, that Solana is a lot less fragmented than Ethereum is currently. I personally don't actually know too much about Solana. We haven't really had too many guests on Rehash who are like in the Solana ecosystem or just well-versed.
Do it.
On it.
I think that there's a lot of interesting lessons to come out of Solana for Ethereum.
Yeah, well, I would love for you to nominate someone for the podcast next season who can really like talk about Solana, because you
should get Raj on. Raj is one of the co-founders of Solana, and he's so great and has just
I'm so down
the best perspective on I think
I'm
how it
totally down.
differentiates.
That would be awesome. I'm so down. In the meantime, could you give us kind of an overview of what that builder ecosystem looks like in Solana as compared to Ethereum? And like outside of this more, outside of this less fragmented plus point, like bonus point that Solana has over Ethereum, like what else are developers considering when they're trying to decide whether to build in Ethereum or Solana?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm mostly really an outsider. I have a lot of friends building in the Solana space, and I was fortunate to be part of kind of an early backer of Solana. So I've gotten to follow along with the ecosystem, but by no means am I building in it myself. But my observation would be that where Ethereum has really embraced kind of decentralization, maximalism, and that goes with not just the technology, but the governance around it and the road mapping of Ethereum, even fostering kind of like the business development or development of applications and all of that. It may also just be a factor of Ethereum being a slightly more mature project where if I think about it, 5 years ago, Ethereum did have these sort of central parties like Consensus, which was a company that was incubating a lot of the Ethereum applications. It was a little bit more Solana-like then. But now Ethereum is just so scattered and so decentralized. And in a way, that's a great thing because I think that lends itself to being a bit more robust, a bit more kind of anti-fragile, to use the sort of like buzzword that a lot of VCs and thought leaders like to use around things like this. But it's lost this ability to be really coordinated, both in terms of technology, and this is, again, what we're talking about in terms of fragmentation and silos, but also just in terms of focus. Whereas Solana, if you've looked at what's happened in their ecosystem over the last couple of years, they've had a huge influx of developers. And those developers, I think, by and large, are looking for a single unified experience. Again, both from the perspective of the technology, but also from the perspective of just having an answer to the question, like, what is this project about? What is the vision here? What should we be focused on? What types of applications do we want to see being built? Just over the last 6 months alone, Solana's had this huge focus on payments and making the developer experience around stable coins and payments use cases and things like that really streamlined, and just really fostering a number of applications that have come along to enable that. And I think that that's really served them well. And you don't hear the same criticism in the Solana ecosystem that you do here in Ethereum, like, you just have all these people building infrastructure. Where are the apps? Like, Solana is building and shipping the apps. And again, I think a lot of that is to do with a much more streamlined. The criticism, of course, would be to say that it's a much more centralized vision, roadmap, and just way of building overall. But I do think it's serving them well. And I also think that it's creating some competitive pressure on Ethereum. I looked at the Electric Capital developers report the other day that tracks the number of developers moving into and out of different ecosystems. And the only two ecosystems that have seen a net developer gain over the last year are Base and Solana. And I think that and Base, of course, launched about a year ago. So, of course, they've been growing. And I think that is really notable. And again, creates really good competitive pressure on Ethereum to make sure that we are not falling behind as an ecosystem, to make sure that we are still providing enough coordination and unified vision and all of that to continue attracting folks to build.
How would you say their infrastructure looks? Because like in the Ethereum space, it's like, we're talking about focusing more on infra instead of apps because we just like aren't there yet with focusing on apps. Like we need to still build out the infra before we're developing on these apps. It sounds like in the Solana ecosystem, they are developing all these cool and engaging apps. Does that mean that their infra is already pretty robust?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's earlier days for Solana, right? And so we'll see as their usage ticks up and, their systems continue to get tested and pushed to their limits. Of course, one of the big criticisms of Solana over the last couple of years has been that it was not robust enough, that it was always falling over, that it was always having these liveness faults. That to my knowledge, is much less of an issue. And I give their team a lot of credit for moving really quickly, always to patch things to get them up again. The other big criticism of Solana from the Ethereum side is that it's too centralized. But they've just made, I think that it's just a fundamentally different set of choices and trade-offs that they've made, where they've said, okay, this is what it looks like to be sufficiently decentralized to enable, kind of the credible neutrality that we want out of blockchains. But we don't have to be full kind of decentralization maximalists and, really sweating about trying to reduce the hardware requirements of node operators and things like this, because we want people to actually use these systems. We want people to be able to build applications that rely on scale. And I think really there's not a right or wrong here. I think that it's just a fundamentally different set of trade-offs. And I think it's working for them right now. And I think it's not so different from sort of the set of trade-offs that Ethereum made versus Bitcoin. And, we saw a lot of people kind of stick with the Bitcoin ethos. And of course, they still have an ecosystem. Now, ironically, a lot of the Bitcoin ecosystem is exploring L2s to try and scale. But it's just a fundamentally different set of trade-offs. I think both are fine. I think that both will coexist and both will attract different devs and different users. But yeah, I think a big part of my mission with Espresso and trying to build this kind of way for chains to coordinate is to reunify Ethereum to some degree, at least from the technical perspective, and provide a competitive edge versus that Solana position.
I mean, as a user, I am all for that. The interoperability problem has been such a headache for me. I think over me and everybody else, like over the last year or two, especially as all of these L2s have been growing, is like, do we, and I'm not a builder myself, but even like trying to decide which L2 to launch our podcast NFTs on, because all of our episodes are published on chain. That has been a headache because when we started, we were still on ETH mainnet. Like that's how long ago that was. Yeah. And so at some point, obviously, we had to migrate to L2. And at that point, there just wasn't a clear quote unquote winner, and I didn't want to have to like keep migrating to whatever like the next
new thing is.
The new thing is. Yeah, exactly. So I kind of delayed that L2 migration process for probably way too long, just because
what L2 did you end up choosing?
We ended up choosing Optimism initially, but then like 3 months later, we moved everything to Base. And so we're on Base now.
This is the problem, right? Is you're like, okay, like Optimism is, now here's Base. Oh, like, is there going to be another thing? Yeah. I mean, again, like there are some benefits of having all of this choice. I think that it creates good competitive pressure even within L2s to continue to evolve their tech stacks and just make it the best experience. And, there's also some sort of like bias alignment, but, you're trying to build a podcast and a media platform. Like you're not trying to spend all day keeping up with what the hot new L2 is. So
exactly. And then from the minting side too, it's like, I don't want to have to make sure that I have enough ETH for gas on all of these different L2s.
Oh my gosh.
Just let me like use whatever L2 I want to use. Let me live.
That is such a real problem. That is such a real issue. Yeah.
Totally.
So make Ethereum composable again. Make Ethereum unified again.
We need that on a hat or a t-shirt or something.
Oh my gosh. Maybe I'll let this election season pass and then we can work on that swag.
Yeah, we need to recover from some past traumas first. Yeah. I do have a couple of questions from Meg's nomination for you that I want to make sure we get to. One thing she wanted to know is, what do you think the future of ZK rollups specifically looks like? We haven't really talked about that yet.
Oh, I think ZK rollups are undoubtedly the future. I just think it's not evenly distributed yet, as they say. And I think that it may also take us a little while to get there. Obviously, optimistic rollups, specifically Optimism, the OP stack, Arbitrum, and the Arbitrum Orbit stack have a huge head start just in terms of distribution amongst developers and end users. But, talking to these teams, they're all aware that ZK is going to be kind of the next generation, and they all have support for ZK on their roadmap. And so, yeah, I think I do think it's worth paying attention to. But I also wouldn't underestimate the first mover advantage that those ecosystems have. And I would not dismiss sort of how much effort and how much work it's going to take to get the technology there and implemented in those two stacks specifically, but also just to get the technology mature in the stacks that it's already in. But yeah, very bullish.
Bullish. Good to know. And then the second question she had is a little more personal. She said, if Jill is comfortable answering, what has been your experience as a new mom?
Oh, it's awesome. It's the best thing ever. I mean, I don't want to go into like, I feel like in Silicon Valley specifically, there's a lot of tech people, especially like it's always male venture capitalists, which like, I'm sorry, it is just different if you are the mom and the person actually like bearing the child and feeding the child and all of that. Firstly, I think it's also, I don't know, I'm not going to dump on VCs. A lot of VCs are very hardworking, but it's just like a different lifestyle from being in the trenches building. Sorry, I can say that having been on both sides. So anyway, I always roll my eyes at all of the like male venture capitalists who are like, everyone should be having babies. It's the best thing ever, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, that is literally so easy for you to say. You know, it's the hardest job I've ever had, being a mom, for sure. And that's saying something. I like to tell people it's like the most unhinged thing I've ever done, becoming a mother, just because there's so many aspects of it of like, yeah, for months on end, you're literally just staying up all night. Like you're not getting more than 2.5, 3.5 hours sleep if you're lucky. And like that's actually illegal in most areas of the world to force someone to work that kind of shift or whatever. And people always laugh and they're like, but you work in crypto. How can being a mom be the most unhinged thing? No, it by far and away is. Go call your mom. Go thank your mom for everything that she did. Everyone listening to this has a mom. Go give her a hug. But it's been so great. And I think it just gives you, for me anyway, it's just given me this whole new, it's trite to say, but sense of purpose, sense of drive and motivation. I think something that people don't talk about a lot is the kind of like mom provider instinct that you get. I feel like I've heard this before with regards to dads, like people become a father and like, I must go provide now for my child and my family. I have totally felt that boost becoming a mom too. Like, I feel like since I learned that I was pregnant, I was like, all right, we've got to go. We've got to like get users and ship mainnet and like make this successful. And it's just given me, another level of drive and boost. And I think that that's been, in the context of crypto, a very cool side effect. The other thing I'll say is that there are so many amazing moms that work in this industry and in this space. I've been fortunate enough to call a bunch of them friends over the years. And, you know, I've gotten to like meet their babies at conferences and stuff like that. And it's really cool to now be a part of that tribe, but also to have had that be visible over the years. I'll never forget seeing Taylor Monahan is now at MetaMask and formerly, you know, was a founder of My Crypto. He was, I want to say ETH Denver 2018 or something like that. She was on stage, like on a panel talking about wallet security with her baby strapped to her. And I was like, that is so badass. We want that to be someday. Yeah, it's just a very cool thing to be a part of. So to any, you know, future parents out there, mom or dad who are listening, it's absolutely amazing. And it is totally doable to do, even with the crazy conference circuit of crypto, but also not to be entered into lightly, for sure. Don't blindly listen to the VC tech boy telling you go procreate.
I'm sorry, but like any dude that wants to give me advice on being a woman, it's not being digested.
Totally. Totally. Yeah.
But yeah, I'm trying to think now where I saw this tweet. It might have actually been from your profile because you just said basically the same thing, which is that being a mom has made you like people think that like, oh, once you're a mom, you're going to like not work as hard because you're going to be focused on your baby or whatever. But it's actually the opposite.
No, what better sense of prioritization can you ask for than having a baby? You know, you're trying to get back to and trying to get home to. It's like, there's no room for BS anymore.
Right.
It's just like
no time wasted.
You're on it.
Every second counts. For
So,
sure.
yeah. No, I wish that was a story that was told more about motherhood. I think that it's super real. I think that it's very universal. But yeah, I think unfortunately it gets lost in a lot of the stereotypes. I think that people have this, certainly I had this kind of conception of motherhood as this like very like soft, sort of like flowery, like, I don't know, like
very demure, very mindful.
Yes, very demure, very mindful. Like, no, it is like you are covered in bodily fluids, running on like 90 minutes of sleep in the last week. Like you are dragging yourself up the stairs and through the trenches. It's like going through Navy SEAL boot camp or something. People don't talk about it that way. Like, this is like the very early days of motherhood. Obviously, not all of it's like that. But like, I wish people had that sort of like level of respect for it, because that I think is a much more reflective experience, reflective description of the whole thing, of what the experience actually is. But.
Yeah, I have had the pleasure through this podcast of meeting so many moms in crypto like yourself. And it's every single one has been so inspirational, at least like for somebody like me who's like more been on the fence, or like on the, not wanting to have kids side of things, but like still on the fence. Like, I think people like you guys are super inspirational for me to talk to and to listen to. And if I ever get to that stage, I'll know who to hit up.
Yeah, no, please. And yeah, anyone who's listening who is at that stage, by all means, I think it's really important to have a support network of people who've done it and are going through it. But there's a lot of us in crypto, so I feel lucky for that.
Yeah, it's so awesome. Last question I ask every guest on the podcast is to give me a can you not? And so this can be like a pet peeve of yours, just something that you want to be like, can you not keep doing this? Like, can we not keep doing this? So is there anything that comes to mind for you?
Okay, this one is very espresso specific and might be kind of niche audience, but there's this whole conception that shared sequencing takes revenue from rollups. And I feel like this is something that, maybe we just haven't done a good enough job of like communicating it or whatever, or like correcting this. But can you not keep saying that, if you use a shared sequencer, you're going to lose your sequencing revenue? It's not the case, okay? This is not an either or. Like, I went through this in kind of the dungeon master analogy. We talked a little bit about this with the marketplace, but I just think that, in crypto especially, you have to have an understanding of the incentives at play. And so my whole mission is to not just build tech that can enable rollups to coordinate, but actually incentivizes them to do so. And shared sequencing has gotten this kind of bad rap of like, it's just stealing revenue from rollups. No, can you not say that? It's not true. Go, I don't know, educate yourself, listen to this podcast, read our docs. So that's my, again, rather niche, but relevant. Can you not?
Very relevant, very on point. Yeah. Boom. Mic drop. Love it. I love that. Hopefully people listen to this. We'll cut a clip of it too, and we'll just like have it circulate. That way, like anytime you see somebody tweet about that, just drop the clip and be like, watch this. And the one last can you not I will add to is just, if you're a dude, can you not tell women how, like, what to do with their bodies, or how easy it is to have a kid, or anything that you have no clue about?
Totally. Amen. Amen. All of these natalist VCs, I'd like to see you go through labor.
Seriously. Gosh. Jill, where can people find you if they want to follow you personally? And also, where can people go to learn more about Espresso?
Awesome. Yeah, Twitter is where it's at. I'm Jill R. Gunter, Gunter, no H, on Twitter. And Espresso is at Espresso Sys, SYS, on Twitter. So find us there. And yeah, looking forward to the feedback from this episode. Thanks so much, Diana.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Jill. We'll be back again next week with another episode of Rehash. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Rehash. Rehash is hosted and produced by me, Diana Chen. Rehash is also supported by our community of NFT holders who curate our guest lineup each season. To get involved, head over to our website at rehashweb3.xyz and collect this episode as an NFT. Anyone who collects an episode becomes part of the Rehash community and will be able to nominate guests for future seasons. To learn more about how to become a guest on the podcast, go to rehashweb3.xyz/podcast And to learn more about sponsoring the podcast, go to rehashweb3.xyz/sponsor. Finally, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at rehashweb3 or on Warpcast and Lens at Rehash. And join our community on Telegram at t.me/rehashweb3. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next week.